The dust hadn't settled when the question cut through the radio chatter like a blade through silk. "Where did you get that Barrett .50? The voice belonged to Master Chief Vincent Rourke, a man whose reputation preceded him through every Spec Ops corridor from Coronado to Dam Neck. But it wasn't the question that made the operations center fall silent. It was the way he asked it, not with anger, not with suspicion, but with something that sounded uncomfortably close to disbelief. The shot had come from 1,100 meters out, through a crosswind that had every spotter in the valley second-guessing their calculations. One round, one target. The high-value individual had been moving between vehicles, a window of maybe 2 seconds, and the bullet had found him through a gap in the convoy that shouldn't have existed in any conventional calculation. The wind had been gusting at 14 knots, inconsistent, the kind of condition that made even the most experienced shooters pack up and wait for better weather. But there hadn't been time to wait. The intelligence was good for maybe another hour before the target vanished into the mountain networks that had swallowed so many others. The forward operating base outside Kandahar was a collection of prefabricated structures and determination, held together by sandbags and the kind of exhaustion that became its own form of fuel. The coffee was terrible. The air smelled like burning trash and aviation fuel. And somewhere in the Tactical Operations Center, a worn photograph was pinned to a corkboard, a young woman in a flight suit, standing beside an A-10 Thunderbolt II, her smile bright against the desert backdrop, her eyes already carrying something heavier than the helmet under her arm. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Cale Northrop, though nobody had called her that in 3 years. Not since the incident. Not since the medical discharge that had turned her from a decorated combat pilot into a question mark with a limp, and too much time to think. The Barrett M82A1 wasn't supposed to be in her hands. The mission wasn't supposed to include her at all. She was a consultant now, a glorified advisor who sat in on briefings and offered tactical input that everyone pretended to consider before doing what they'd already decided. But the regular sniper team had been delayed by a sandstorm that turned the sky into a wall of amber static, and the window on the target was closing like a fist, and someone had made a decision that probably wasn't in any manual. Cale had picked up the rifle like she was greeting an old friend. The weapon was almost 30 pounds of precision engineering, its distinctive muzzle brake designed to manage the massive recoil of the .50 BMG round. She'd checked the scope, adjusted for the wind that was lying to everyone, and taken a position on the roof of the operations building where the angle was all wrong, and the distance was past anything reasonable. The wind had been the key. Everyone else was reading it as a problem. She'd seen it as a language, one she'd learned to speak fluently during 273 combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq, her A-10 flying low enough to taste the dust, close enough to see the faces of the people she was protecting, close enough to see the faces of those she wasn't. The sky had always made sense to her in ways the ground never quite did. Trajectories were just flight paths on a smaller scale. Physics didn't care whether you were in a cockpit or behind a rifle. The wind told you everything if you knew how to listen. The way it moved over terrain, the thermal currents rising from sun-heated rock, the subtle pressure changes that pushed and pulled at anything trying to move through it. She'd calculated the drop, led the target by what felt like instinct but was actually 10,000 hours of pattern recognition, and squeezed the trigger during the half-second pause between heartbeats. The radio had exploded with confirmation codes and grid coordinates, the controlled chaos of a successful strike. Then Rourke's voice cutting through it all with that question. "Where did you get that Barrett .50? She'd stared at the rifle for a long moment before keying her mic. "Supply tent, Master Chief. Same place as everyone else." The lie was smooth, automatic, the kind of deflection that had become second nature, but Rourke wasn't buying it and they both knew it. Because the question hadn't really been about the weapon. It had been about the shot, about the woman who'd made it, about why someone with her file was sitting on a roof in Kandahar instead of flying combat air patrol over hostile territory like she'd been born to do. The sun was setting over the Hindu Kush, painting the mountains in shades of copper and shadow. Kale broke down the Barrett with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through the disassembly sequence while her mind was somewhere else entirely. 3 years ago, she'd been one of the youngest pilots to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. Her call sign had been Valkyrie, chosen not by her but by her squadron after a mission where she'd stayed on station for 4 hours past bingo fuel, providing close air support for a Marine unit that would have been overrun otherwise. She'd landed with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining and hadn't mentioned it until the maintenance crew saw the gauges. The Marines had sent her a bottle of whiskey and a handwritten note that said simply, "Thanks for the extra time." She still had the note. The whiskey had been gone within a week. The medical discharge had come after a mission that started routine and ended with her aircraft taking an RPG through the left engine. The A-10 was designed to take damage. The bathtub of titanium armor around the cockpit had saved countless pilots from ground fire, but the explosion had caused a hydraulic failure that turned the aircraft into a barely controllable brick. She'd nursed it back to base, brought it down in a landing that crumpled the landing gear, and sent the airframe skidding across the runway in a shower of sparks that looked like fireworks from the tower. The crash had shattered her left leg in 14 places. The subsequent surgeries had given her titanium pins and a permanent limp. The medical board had given her a discharge with honors and a recommendation for a desk job. She'd walked out of the hearing and hadn't looked back. But the sky had other plans. Or maybe it was just that some people couldn't quite let go of the things that had defined them, even when those things were no longer officially part of their lives. The consulting position had come through back channels, someone who remembered Valkyrie and thought her tactical mind might still have value even if her flying days were over. She'd taken it because the alternative was teaching at some staff college, and the idea of standing in front of a classroom talking about close air support doctrine to people who'd never felt the stick shake in their hands during a gun run made her want to disappear into the bottom of a bottle. At least here, in theater, she could still smell the aviation fuel, could still hear the turbines spooling up, could still pretend, sometimes, that she was still part of it. The operations center was buzzing when she limped through the door, the Barrett case slung over her shoulder. Conversations died like someone had flipped a switch. She could feel the eyes tracking her across the room, the whispered consultations. Rourke was standing by the main display screen, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was somewhere in his late 40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from too many deployments and not enough sleep. His uniform was faded from countless washings, the trident on his chest polished to a dull gleam. He'd been doing this job since before Cale had learned to drive, and he had the quiet confidence of someone who'd forgotten more about combat than most people would ever learn. When their eyes met, something shifted in the air. Not quite challenge, not quite respect, but somewhere in the territory between. "Walk with me," he said, not waiting for an answer. Cale followed him out of the operations center and into the compound, past the rows of containerized housing units and the motor pool where mechanics were working under portable lights, their tools clanking against metal in a rhythm that sounded almost musical. The night air was cool, a relief after the stuffiness of the TOC. Overhead, the stars were emerging like pinpricks in black velvet, the kind of display you never saw near civilization. Rourke walked with purpose, his boots crunching on gravel, until they reached the edge of the compound where the barriers gave way to empty desert, and the mountains loomed like the spine of some sleeping giant. 1,100 meters, Rourke said, his voice quiet. 14-knot crosswind, moving target, 2-second window. He paused, looking out at the darkness. "I've worked with some of the best shooters in the community, men who have spent their entire careers behind a rifle. That shot would have been 50-50 for most of them, maybe 60-40 if they were having a really good day." He turned to face her, and in the dim light from the compound, his expression was thoughtful. "You made it look easy." Cale shifted her weight, feeling the dull ache in her leg that was her constant companion. "It wasn't easy, Master Chief. I got lucky." "Bullshit." The word was delivered without heat, just a statement of fact. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between luck and skill. That was skill. That was pattern recognition and spatial awareness and about 10,000 hours of doing something similar in a different context. He studied her face. You were a pilot. A-10s, if I remember your file correctly. The Warthog, close air support platform. You spent your entire career calculating angles and wind speeds and target movement, just from a different altitude. She didn't confirm or deny it, just stood there in the darkness, waiting. Rourke continued, the question isn't whether you can shoot. You just proved that. The question is why you're here instead of up there. He gestured at the sky, at the vast emptiness above them. And why someone with your capabilities is being treated like a secretary with a bad leg. The words hit harder than she'd expected. Cale felt something tighten in her chest, that old familiar combination of anger and grief that she'd learned to keep locked down. The flight docs made their decision, Master Chief. I'm not medically cleared for combat flight operations. End of story. Her voice was steady, professional, the same tone she'd used in countless debriefings. But underneath it was something else, something raw that she couldn't quite hide. Rourke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on her face. Then he said, my daughter wants to be a pilot. She's 17, already got her private license, talking about the Naval Academy and flying F-35s off carriers. Smart kid, determined. Reminds me a little of you, actually, from what I've read in your file. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, become something softer. If someone told her that her dreams were over because of something beyond her control, something that happened while she was doing her job, I think it would break something inside her, something important.